I think it's crazy for musicians and labels not to be looking at digital platforms as a way to, add additional ways of bringing that music to market and tapping into an audience that are very hard to reach in other ways.
You're listening to the Playlist Podcast. I'm Benjamin Dorr, and today we are talking with Chris Davey, who is a games, music, and entertainment innovator. Chris spent 15 years at Blizzard Entertainment, rising to MD while running publishing for Australia and New Zealand. He was an early regional employee at both Blizzard Entertainment and Epic Games, and is now supporting the music industry as an investor advisor with Impressed Recordings, while also running his consultancy Target Light in Sydney, Australia. So without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. I was really blown away by your career today, being quite phenomenal, not just in terms of, the places you've worked and the roles that you've had in those places, but the kind of impact the companies have had on the gaming landscape. And I also find it fascinating that you do have kind of this through line with music and how that's kind of taken you to where you're at now. Did you always want to be involved with video games? Was this something that you wanted, that you thought that's the path for me? Or was it more of a situation of, you kind of landed somewhere and it evolved organically?
Great question. I'm one of those guys that got into gaming a very long time ago and always had a passion for it, had a love for it. I have vivid memories of buying a copy of Byte magazine to key in, games using BASIC on a VIC-20 back in the day. And I was lucky enough to have a neighbor who was an engineer that helped me take this thing from 5K of memory up to 20 so I could play games, which of course were all on cassette at the time. So yeah, I was very, 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 early in the space, and I just had a massive passion for it. And I had a bit of an epiphany in my early 20s. I just moved out to British Columbia. I'd had a pretty crap job at a university. And I just decided at that point that I needed to love what I did, knowing that, work is going to eat up about a 30-year life. So I slowly but surely found my way into technology, and then worked for a .com in Vancouver, right in the lead up to the implosion of, that kind of first round of internet businesses in the late 90s. And then when I got to Australia, there's something really incredible about being an expat and relocating to the other side of the world. You're out of your element. You probably push yourself a little bit harder in different ways. And so very committed to trying to find a way into a great tech job. I ended up selling ads in video game magazines, a company called Next Media located in Redfern near Sydney. And then I got a chance to really meet a lot of folks that were working on the publisher side, and found an opportunity to move across. And then, landing at Vivendi, which at the time, Vivendi was a really funny business, originally a water company out of France that turned into this massive, multifaceted entertainment company. And the jewel in their crown was Blizzard Entertainment. And I had an opportunity to get to know Blizzard quite well in those early days working at Next Media. So yeah, my very first year in the games industry in 2004 was launching World of Warcraft and Half-Life 2 within a week of each other, which is a great trial by fire.
I can imagine. That's incredible. You mentioned a couple of things there. I remember the end of the .com business in the 90s because I was kind of late high school, early university. And I remember working the bar at .com events, and there was so much money and so much hope and hype, so I was very much aware of that. And then going back to Vivendi, as you said, they started as a water company, but I think people underestimate the role French companies have in video games and how they've shaped the landscape, and going to, Ubisoft and Gameloft, but also releases like Clair Obscura. Yeah, I think France is definitely, it'd be a fascinating, someone's probably done this, but a fascinating book on, how France has really helped shape video games over the past 3 or 4 decades.
There's no doubt there's something tied to the culture and the language of the creativity side of game development. They're just, masterful in a lot of ways. And they're just very, very good operators from a corporate standpoint. I saw some really interesting perspective working for a French headquartered company. And I was lucky enough to have, learned how to speak French as a kid in Canada. So it was really quite interesting to get a job in the industry and then be dealing with counterparts that spoke a language I was familiar with. So that was a really interesting, unique moment I wasn't really expecting when I jumped over to a games company.
Yeah. Were you from Quebec?
No, I was a military brat, so I'd lived coast to coast. But my mom spoke Acadian French, which is kind of its own unique dialect on the East Coast. And then I lived in Ottawa for many years. So Ottawa is a very bilingual city. The Ottawa River separates Quebec from Ontario. So I spent a lot of time in Quebec in those kind of high school and university days.
Going back in time, again, you were kind of mentioning the cassettes before, and putting codes in for video games. What was the first game that really, opened your eyes to what video games could be or kind of got your attention?
Yeah, like I'm just such a huge consumer of entertainment, like whether it's music or television or movies and games. And it's funny in a world where we talk about transmedia, and you and I chatted quite a bit about, this concept of building IP and finding all these entertainment categories to plug the IP into to grow it. And I have such vivid memories. This would be, I think the age was probably about 13 at the time, spending a lot of time in arcades. So I really developed this absolute love affair with arcades. And it would be Tron. There was something about the arcade cabinet, the fact that, the storyline and narrative for the film ties into being pulled into a video game machine. So it was this fascination with the technology under the hood as much as it was the kind of game itself. So yeah, I remember, I don't know what they did for speakers inside of that machine, but there was just a hum, like it was the hum of the light cycle that would just kind of come out as you'd walk into an arcade. It was louder than any other machine in the arcade. So yeah, I spent a shocking amount of time on it, managed to finish the game, and we're talking thousands of quarters, 25-cent piece for those that aren't familiar with the quarter concept.
Yeah.
And just loved it, right? It would have been, and I was very lucky because very shortly after we got into Tron, Dragon's Lair came out, which was another one of the really over the top experiences. And even though like the interface was incredibly simple in Dragon Age, it was just, the fidelity, the animation, the art style. And again, gave you that kind of Disney film feel, right? That rotoscoped animation. So yeah, I just, when I think back to those early days, Tron would definitely be one that jumped out.
I think both those picks are interesting because, Tron, it wasn't just a kind of a film or, a game time. It was such an immersive world and had such an incredible soundtrack by Wendy Carlos and made such an impact on the culture in a way that not many films there weren't many films dealing with video games back when that was released, but it's incredible the longevity that franchise has had and the outpouring of fandom and also the impact on music itself. Obviously the Daft Punk were involved with Legacy and Nine Inch Nails with Aries and Dragon's Lair, I'm a massive animation geek, and the characters were designed by Don Bluth, and I guess the animated scenes. And again, like it felt so immersive because it really was like playing a cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it was up, left, right, down, and a sword button. It was just so simple, but it was the magic of how they brought the characters to life and taking advantage of, new technology. I think the whole thing ran on a laser disc inside the box. It really blew me away. And Space Ace came out after that as well, which was, an equally like incredible game to play. And this was the first time a machine had gone from 25 cents to 50 cents as well.
Right.
So it was a real leap of faith. Like we would often go into the arcade with a very preset amount of money. Like we might have had, let's call it, $2 to $3. So that's 8, 12 play sessions. And if you're going to double down on one, and as you know, it's very easy to die if you didn't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Dragon's Lair. So yeah, really awesome stuff. I'll even add one third one to that because again, I'm getting quite nostalgic about that arcade moment. The Star Wars game that came out, the vector-driven original Star Wars game. And it had a sit-down cabinet or a stand-up, and they had the sit-down one in this particular arcade. And I can just remember, like, again, feeling transported quite quickly through the power of like some synthesized voices, even though it was really crunchy. I could still vividly remember Obi-Wan Kenobi when your character, you'd lose a life and you'd hear that voice coming over the top. Absolutely loved it. And that was actually, this is a totally other story, but my love of vector. I became an illustrator in my late teens and early 20s and really fell in love with the concept of vector art. I had a Vectrex, which was a home console machine that was all vector driven. And still to this day, I love the power of vector versus pixel based art.
I found it really interesting recently. Roger Avery, who is the co-writer of Pulp Fiction and has directed some great films himself, like Rules of Attraction, he was on a podcast and it kind of let it slip that he collects arcade machines, but specifically like Vector X and like vector-based kind of arcade machines. And he actually supplies a lot of the machines for Flynn's Arcade at Disney World. But he also, not only does he collect them, but he also repairs them himself because there's all these parts inside of them that kind of burn out quite easily.
Yes.
I had no idea that he, collected the machines and supplied them, but just knew so much about them. So if you dig around online, you can kind of look up his journey with that. But yeah, I think a lot of people do love the kind of Vector X arcade machines. I want to talk about Blizzard because, you were the managing director of Blizzard Entertainment. What were your kind of 2 or 3 main takeaways from your experience in that role and how have they kind of transferred to other roles or your life in general?
Oh, wow. That's a huge question. Yeah, I was at Blizzard for 15 years. So that first job with Vivendi was managing PR. And very quickly I moved into brand management and kind of was responsible for every facet of how we brought those products to market in region. So it was everything from engaging with retail because there was no digital transaction. Well, the interesting thing is when we shipped Half-Life 2, Valve, of course, launched Steam simultaneously with that. So that was another really powerful moment where, as a distributor for a product, you didn't realize that there was this audience that were prepared to buy these games digitally, right? It was just so early on. And so yeah, I've learned every single aspect on what traditionally today we call publishing. Back in the day, it was just marketing or integrated marketing. So everything from PR to standing up social channels to managing esports ecosystems in market. The thing I loved about Blizzard is it was truly the crash course in every aspect of how you bring a game to market. And what was unique about Blizzard, and this is testament to Mike Morhaime, and the incredible work he did building up that company and the culture, was, nothing was out of bounds. So, we had the ability to engage directly with the development team on regular occasions. So you'd have to build the relationships up. We would get devs that would come into the region for a launch. I got to meet the StarCraft 2 development team probably first because that was, one of World of Warcraft was, that's another story altogether because it was just such a crazy launch because no one really expected it to reach the popularity that it did and so quickly. So by the time we kind of set it up and found our footing, we built those relationships and the devs were just so blown away when they would come into a region. Australia is great because it's very approachable for a US based dev. It's familiar, the language is the same, but they would really pick up on all the nuances. And so they were very, very, they really got the fact that Aussie gamers were Aussie gamers and they had their own particular view. And of course, they had a lot of issues, right? Because Blizzard games predominantly were online and their connectivity to US West from this part of the world was shocking. But Australians kind of sucked it up for a long time. Sure, they asked for servers and we did give it to them in my time at Blizzard. That's another thing I learned was how to set up an internet data center to be able to support multiplayer games and game purchases through payment gateways in market. So, kind of an IT opportunity as well in that experience at Blizzard. But it was the opportunity to engage deeply with the dev team and really engage with again, going back to the art and design of video games, not just the monetization of video games. And I still have lifelong friends to this day that worked across a number of those dev teams.
Yeah.
Another thing is really how to fight for a region. I think historically a lot of, US based multinationals just continue to deliver a US based product and a US based marketing message. And we worked really, really hard with in my time at Blizzard and again at Epic to highlight the importance and the value of really engaging with fans on the ground, using the right nomenclature. We're in the opposite side of the world. So, traditionally when there's an in-game event in December, it's going to be Christmas and snow-based. And while the Christmas component works down in this part of the world, the snow certainly doesn't. We always really positioned ourselves at Blizzard as being Blizzard, right? Blizzard ANZ really stood for something. We really got behind that concept. So our social tone, the engagement we had with content creators, with the media, with esports orgs, we had some really amazing folks working on our community management team. And the fans really, really appreciated that. And then, this concept of super fan, which is a term that's just thrown around constantly, we were some of the early originators on that. So
Yeah.
we would, if we did an event, we'd bring a dev over, and these started as small community events in our office, but then ended up as 4K Dolby Atmos movie cinema experiences later on. We would bring all facets. So it would be the traditional old school media. It would be the new generation of content creators. It would be some of these esports players and the orgs that supported them. And then we would bring some of the most engaged fans. We would invite them as well. And it's amazing when you've got, an event with 100 people and you bring 10 fans who are incredibly active on the forums and on social channels. You bring them closer to the family and they really get it. And so you're kind of deputizing them as an extension of the
Mhm.
Blizzard family in this part of the world, which I think was a really special moment for the business. And I saw the success we had in terms of releases and our ability to support the product as effectively as they did at any other market worldwide. And we did so with a much smaller team.
What is a game that you have started playing that you were enjoying, but circumstance, life got in the way that you never went back to? Kind of your biggest game of shame.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this one before, and this is one that I'm kind of throwing myself on the sword in some way, and that's the fact that I never I never went all in on World of Warcraft. So, and there's a bunch of reasons for that, right? Like particularly in that launch window I talked about, like it was just so surreal to be launching Half-Life 2 and WoW so close to each other, and both of them, of course, were runaway success. They were sold out at retail. In World of Warcraft's case, we couldn't even put ship boxes to retail because the servers imploded. So there's an extended period of time where we had a great campaign to support it. I think we thought we were going to do 30,000 units, and within a year and a half, we did 300,000 units. It was, and of course, everybody wanted a copy of the game, and I was the gatekeeper on any of those PR copies we still had around. But yeah, Half-Life 2 was really more my jam at the time. So when World of Warcraft first shipped, I just had other games that were occupying my time. And then, whenever an expansion would come out, I would jump back into it. I'd do all the early game. The cinematics, of course, supporting WoW were so incredible. So I loved the storylines. I loved the narrative. I loved the world. I loved the marketing materials we did. But I'm just not an MMO guy. I'm really not an RPG guy to a large extent. So yeah, I dipped in and out so many times, and my whole team were just so infatuated with that game, but it never got its hooks in me. So yeah, it's definitely a disappointment that I never got to feel that magic from a player's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I've never played World of Warcraft. I've never played Half-Life 2.
Oh, we got you on both of those.
On both, but you said you don't really like MMOs or RPGs, and I'm quite similar. And I think maybe it's the fantasy genre that doesn't necessarily appeal to me. But that said, and at the danger of this becoming a podcast series where I talk about Elden Ring all the time, I love Elden Ring, and I think that game, the world kind of really drew me in. And I was trying to analyze why that fantasy setting or those themes were more appealing than other fantasy themes. And I think it's much more, there's a poetry to it. But I do feel generally like fantasy is not the thing that pulls me in personally.
Yeah. Oh no, I'm very. If I had to, pick my genre, it would definitely be sci-fi over fantasy.
Yeah.
I've gotten into fantasy a lot more through Game of Thrones and the Lord of the Rings films.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think certain games, like with WoW, I just kept thinking it was like getting into a good book that was just hard to crack the code on.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to kind of pick up back on, you were talking about Fortnite. So you were watching Fortnite in the early days while you were at Blizzard.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the whole kind of like Drake moment, and of course, this is the explosion of Twitch as well, right? Twitch was an effective platform, but all of a sudden, when you could start bringing in non-traditional users to experience these cultural moments, right? And so, yeah, we watched it quite closely. And then when I left Blizzard, there was someone I'd worked with on the marketing team that had moved across to Epic. And because, not too dissimilar to the change management challenges Blizzard faced when World of Warcraft shipped, it was kind of similar in a way to the changes at Epic were so pronounced and dramatic. Because when you have a product that truly, back then we didn't call it viral, but that's really what it was, right? It just caught its footing so quickly and then just kind of became part of the cultural zeitgeist, and everybody wanted to kind of lean in and have a look. So yeah, it very quickly, I kind of came over to just help Epic do an assessment on the regional market and the opportunity. I talked about, regionalizing publishing and go to market in this part of the world. Australian gamers are incredible, right? They back up their love of the industry with their wallets. It's a very high ARPU market. While it's kind of limited on population, I think Australia today is about 27 billion. We can pull squeeze on for another 4 and get, a reasonable number, but just, the amount of investment people put into their love of gaming in a country that is predominantly an outdoor beach loving, summer runs, a good chunk of the year. It always blew us away that Australia and New Zealand were just so committed to gaming. And so going across and running this, consulting project for Epic very quickly turned into them taking me on as kind of a 4-day-a-week consultant. And then within 4 months, I was back to the 60-hour-a-week grind that I kind of hoped I would find myself back into after leaving Blizzard. And then that was a good 3 years. And don't forget, COVID was in the middle of that too. So this whole idea of a distributed kind of workforce was a big challenge the company faced at the time. Yeah, really enjoyed my time. And I think I brought a lot of the legwork I did with the team at Blizzard over a huge number of years. I kind of plugged that directly into what we were doing, products like Fortnite. And when Overwatch shipped, that's when the idea of the content creator really started hitting its stride. And there's a guy, Elliot Watkins, who went by Muselk at the time, was a Team Fortress 2 player, and he came across to Overwatch. And, these are the types of people that not only would we bring into the office to kind of, invite into the Blizzard family ecosystem for these community events, but we would put them on planes and we would send them across for, some of these big PR events. We would bring the community manager for EB Games across. So, I was kind of really pushed, let's broaden out the approach. If it's a PR event, let's not just have people that are doing traditional journalism on these trips. Let's find anybody that can help supercharge the noise around that. 2 very interesting businesses that really did kind of feed into the pop culture moment. And then there's 1,000 different stories from my time at Epic, but there was a real kind of commitment to doing great things. And some of the biggest content creators for Fortnite in the world were right here in Australia. That's another great thing about Australia people don't realize is the Australian accent is unique and interesting. To other English-speaking countries, there's kind of an exotic nature of the Aussie accent. And so you had guys like Lachlan and Loser Fruit and Laserbeam who were just becoming incredibly huge. At the same time, Fortnite was getting big, and Fortnite had the supported creator code affiliate ecosystem. So they were monetizing their play in game by getting a clip of cosmetic sales. And so, yeah, it was an awesome journey to be on. I wasn't there when Fortnite blew up, but I was there, at its peak and then running those peaks and valleys into the transition of Fortnite into a platform where it sits today.
You're 100% right about, the Australian accent kind of being perceived as unique. But it's also for me, when I'm traveling and I hear an Australian accent, it cuts through the crowd, but also on TikTok, Aussie creators who are very authentic in their voice, definitely have a unique take. And I think Australians are very entrepreneurial and very just a go get 'em attitude. And that does come across in content creation. And what game was your biggest discovery in terms of, playing as a fan? What was the thing that you discovered and you went, this is the best?
Yeah, well, Half-Life 2, and it's quite interesting. And you'd mentioned you haven't played Half-Life 2. I've just gotten a Steam Deck, and that's a wild piece of hardware, and it's allowed me to go back into that Steam account because I predominantly work on a Mac, and so I haven't had a proper PC for gaming, and so the Steam Deck's very quickly become that, and so I'm replaying Half-Life 2 and the follow-up episodes. And it's running like absolute magic. So there's still time for you to jump in if you decide you want to try it out.
I definitely want to play Half-Life 2. I have, I'm pretty sure in my Steam library, Half-Life 2. I get overwhelmed with the amount of things that I should play and need to play. But, I think from when you work in games, people just assume you play a lot of games. And I do, but not at the volume as probably like someone who is not in the games industry.
Going back to your question about like really powerful games, Half-Life 2 is just another one of those incredibly immersive experiences, incredible sound design, really thoughtful puzzles, and then great visceral action. Like I'm a real Twitch FPS guy. Like my background, I played a ton of the original Marathon, which is quite topical considering the new one's coming out imminently. But
Hmm.
I worked in a design studio as an illustrator, and we just had those Bondi Blue IMAX. They couldn't play a lot, but they could play Marathon, and they could play Quake 3 Arena we used to play in the original Quake 1 and 2. So that was kind of our in-house multiplayer experience. But Half-Life 2, that just brought it together into a real cinema style environment. So maybe going back to this concept that we talked about with Tron, like when you can create something that just touches on so many different kind of entertainment spaces. And Half-Life 2 just felt so beautifully cinematic. And it was some of the best lip syncing we'd seen, some really great character design. And then off the back of that experience for them to, run with Portal, which, leverage the gravity gun and finding ways to double down on the puzzle experience and then still bring in that very kind of like gritty, Valve, dry, dark humor that they were so incredibly effective with. And because Half-Life 2 just celebrated its anniversary. And so there's an amazing documentary that Valve did that went very deeply into the launch, including some of the challenges with Vivendi. They go into a lot of those details. So I was on the other side of the fence at the time, but it's just so amazing to see it from Valve's perspective on, what it was like to bring that game to market, what it was like for a developer to work with external publishers. And I highly recommend giving it a watch if you've got some time. It runs a good solid hour and change, but like everything Valve touches, the quality and the polish is incredible, even with their linear content.
You're absolutely right about Valve. Like when I think of Valve as a brand, like I think of integrity. Like it's not someone that's, you know, other hardware brands or publishers will go through kind of a brand refresh or identity refresh. But Valve has been pretty consistent in terms of its presentation of who they are for a very long time. And I think because of that, people definitely, have a perception of them and their work speaks for itself as well. Like I've been replaying Portal 2 with my son on Xbox, and it's just incredible, and I love seeing him try and work out puzzles, and I think it's such an immersive experience that has great game design and great world building and storytelling. And yeah, I think Volvo are incredible, and I'm very curious to see how, once this people adopt Steam Deck, versus kind of other console hardware and see where their journey kind of takes them. Because I do think they've got a very interesting next chapter ahead of them.
Yeah, oh, definitely. And I love how they just don't give up. They've put the living room based PC console. They've tried that in the past. They license out the OS to other hardware partners. They're giving it another go with the Steam box, and I think they've learned a lot with the success of the Steam Deck. And then they're not giving up on VR, right? I still think VR is incredible, right? The concepts of persistence. All I've got here is an Oculus 2. I'll tell you, man, we put thousands of hours into that, and the kids love it as well. And I cannot wait to see what Valve do in the space. And the fact that I think they're really committed to deep immersive experiences, and VR does provide something the others can't. And with everybody else just going all in on AI, looking at Meta specifically on that comment, maybe there's going to be an interesting gap that Valve can fill in and do some really cool stuff in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I've had an Oculus 1, 2, like Oculus 3, and I think that, recently with Meta kind of distancing Oculus from Horizon Worlds was probably the best thing it could have done. And it's such a powerful technology and provides such a level of immersion. I do think it's in good hands with Valve. I actually just wanted to you made a shout out to Marathon. There is a great music video / cinematic that was released for Marathon. I think maybe even today.
I think I haven't watched it yet, but I saw it pop up in my feed.
Yeah. So it was directed by Harmony Korine, who is a film director generally, who did Spring Breakers and Kids.
Yeah, I know him very well. I've watched everything he's ever done. So the Harmony Korine connection is what got my attention immediately.
Have you kind of looked at what he's doing with Edgelord, his AI slash gaming slash narrative studio?
I have not. No, I'm going to write a note though.
Oh,
Edgelord.
it is very interesting, and I mean, he's always been a bit of a provocateur and an incredible artist. But I think over his career, because this is someone in his early 50s, and he's done fashion and film and all these different things. But seeing where he's pushing things in the gaming space is incredibly exciting for me because it's blending art, it's blending narrative, and also allowing him to bleed into other kind of AAA releases in certain ways, even if it's on the kind of the content side. Incredibly exciting.
Yeah, like can give it to Bungie, right? Like that's not the obvious kind of collab partner you would think for a launch like this, right? But
Hmm.
again, for me, I come from more of the creative artistic side as opposed to how you hyper commercialize things. And,
Yeah.
in my time, cheering an opposite Activision, seeing those over the top, bombastic Robert Downey Jr. rocket shot Call of Duty launches, seeing Harmony Korine do something really cool with Marathon to me just speaks volumes. And it's not going to get them the mainstream cut through, but man, people who know are going to know that that's cool as.
Yeah. And I think the rule is number one, be interesting. I mean, they could have just put out a cinematic but this adds an extra kind of meta layer to it. And speaking of music, you were very involved in some of the early Fortnite explorations with kind of musical integrations of having artists performing game or, building out that path. How hard was it early on to convince the guys at Epic that it was a good idea? And where do you feel, given they've done so many groundbreaking things with, Travis Scott and Daft Punk, and where do you think the future of that lies with Fortnite?
Yeah, I was very lucky that Fortnite, had kind of run its explosive course as it really kind of blew up. And, Tim was doubling down on the concept of the metaverse, and this kind of ubiquitous ecosystem that you could plug into a number of different ways. And there was a number of kind of entertainment verticals the company was focusing in on. And it included fashion and it included sports, it included music. So there was a lot of conversation internally about how the company was going to lean into these sorts of things. And so, you would have a business development group based in the US that were building up great relationships with brands across all of those different ecosystems. So, there was a Polo collab and a Montclair collab and there were some interesting things that happened in and around football experience. We were able to get some A-League teams inside of that global event. So, I was the one and only person supporting publishing for Epic in this part of the world. And so I was always leaning in to try and find ways to plug, regional kind of IP holders into these three different verticals. So constantly riffing on the idea. And then because, I have such a love of music, that was the one I probably leaned into the most. And some stuff was kind of originated here, like I'd submitted a whole number of artists that I thought would have been relevant because Epic, listen, you'll give it to Epic at the time, I think they really contracted on this kind of global approach to the product in a lot of ways. But at the time, there was a real desire to bring regionally relevant collab partners into the ecosystem. But obviously, being a global product, and Tim was adamant about the metaverse experience in and around Fortnite was very much a global experience. It was never an instant based thing that would pocket around the world. Everything was available to everybody. And so, yeah, the first one would have been Tones and I. And so, that's a great Australian artist who did have the viral moment with Dance Monkey. And so it was something that, had global appeal, but real regional relevance. So that was a lot of fun to work on. And that was with Sony Music. And I got to know a lot of the folks at Sony quite well through the course of that project. I was lucky enough to be on calls with the development studio. So it was an external studio that were
Mhm.
very experienced in UEFN and Fortnite Creative at the time. UEFN had been quite shipped at that point. And so they were contracted to build the experience. And Tones was on some of those calls. The management team was on those calls. The label was on those calls. But the concept of music is very convoluted in a way, right? Sony Music had the relationship with Tones in Australia, New Zealand, but it was Warner Brothers that had the publishing rights globally. So a lot of cooks in the kitchen. But that was a real fun project to bring to market. And then the second one was the kid LAROI. So he's got such an amazing story on how he found his voice and how he hustled so hard and his background, growing up in the projects in Waterloo, he had a lot of obstacles in his path to fame. These are two artists that had a real connection to the product. Like Tones wasn't a Fortnite gamer, but geez, she was really excited to learn about the space. And she thought it was such an amazing platform for her to be able to deliver her music. And there was a whole experience in extended reality stage ecosystem. So her and her band went into a green screen, and there was a bunch of Unreal powered visuals that kind of drove the background to that component.
Yeah.
And the kid LAROI, we one of the first images that we used to tease the experience was him probably at the age of like 10, which was, Fortnite's a 13-year-old product in this part of the world. So we had to kind of play around with the narrative around that. But there's a picture of him playing Fortnite, right? As a
Yeah.
very, very young kid. And so it was authentic. It was real. It made a lot of sense. So yeah, working, with a number of different parties on those and seeing those come to market and seeing millions and millions of people engaging with these experiences. And the development team that worked on those experiences were a good chunk of their team were based here in Australia. So there was a really nice Australian story that went along with not just the artists themselves, but the development process and the engagement with the music labels.
You kind of talk about the regionalization and music side. I think it's interesting that obviously in Fortnite recently, you've had Lisa from Blackpink pop up, you've had Hatsune Miku, you kind of really diverse artists from different parts of the world pop up. But I do think that you're getting there's a lot more diversity in the kinds of artists and where they're from and how they're affecting culture in general. And then that's reflected back into Fortnite. And that's exciting. Like I'm glad they do kind of take more exciting picks in terms of the artists. I was super happy they put Gorillas in because I think that's a long overdue kind of for that property. But where do you think it will end up in terms of, obviously, Disney have put a lot of money into with Epic and they're doing things, but do you think that kind of music in Fortnite will evolve in a certain way? Or
I think it's very early days on what you can do to leverage the platform, to engage with the audience, to build up a very clear global launch strategy for music. As you know, the commodification of music through streaming platforms is making it really hard to connect with music and artists, and discoverability is becoming so challenged because of the role of the algorithm and force feeding content to you that it thinks you want to hear, but there's no surprise. There's no real magic moment. So, I still think there's huge opportunities for artists and the labels and management teams that support them to build really powerful, engaging experiences. You don't have to just continue to recycle the same idea, but you can bring something that's truly interactive, that's true to the art form, that's very authentic to the artist. Epic continue to evolve. What the Fortnite as a platform ecosystem can look like. Back in the day, you could just use Fortnite assets, right? And now,
yeah,
with the power of UEFN, you could bring anything into the game experience. You could create your own character, your own outfits and skins and cosmetics, and now you can start to monetize those. And I know it's still challenging, and it's the Wild West, and figure out how to make that stuff work. But I think it played well. And when you think of the power of a music label to launch an artist, right, they can do really clever and interesting and unique things, whether it's, supercharging the live experience or bringing really clever merch programs to support that. You can't rely on the music distribution platform to do it on its own anymore because it is what it is, but you can do really clever things in the ancillary world. And so it's that concept of transmedia again. And
yeah.
I think it's crazy for musicians and labels not to be looking at digital platforms as a way to, add additional ways of bringing that music to market and tapping into an audience that are very hard to reach in other ways.
I do think some of the struggle there is kind of legacy when it comes to, promoting an artist and where the spend goes. And I know there's curiosity from particular labels or management for these things, but I still think there's a gap of understanding of what is possible. And I do think, in that space, the artists that do succeed really well in transmedia are really driving it themselves because they have a quite solid understanding of how it works. Going back to Fortnite, the ability to bring a metahuman that looks like the artist into UEFN and taking motion capture data and creating a lot of content that can, live as vertical on TikTok, but also be playable in game and also be a music video on YouTube. And now with kind of the evolving marketplace of, artists being able to sell branded items and things like that, it's a really exciting tool, and I think as long as it's viewed as like a content creation tool that can fill multiple platforms, I think it really does come down to artists being incredibly savvy about how to connect with audiences and probably educating their labels and their management as well.
Yeah, historically, it was always like this unbelievable moment when an icon skin would drop in Fortnite. And, like as an example, Chapel Roan's just come to the game and she was kind of like asking to get into the game a year ago, right? She
Yeah.
effectively wanted to be in the game and understood the power of the platform. But doesn't it seem crazy that for relatively low cost barriers, any artist can be in Fortnite, right?
Mm.
But just by using the Unreal tools to bring them in. So yeah, I think I'm hoping that that Unreal is a platform and Fortnite as a sandbox can continue to offer opportunities for characters to create a digital avatar. And as
Yeah.
you know, Fortnite's got such a unique style, and there's an unbelievable amount of content to draw on in terms of how the internal artists build those things. I would love nothing more than to just see more and more people kind of play around in that space. And as you know, discoverability is everything. And when there's so many experiences, it's really hard to get that cut through. And Epic still has some headwinds, right? On like you've got to have that 9 or 12 digit code to find the island, and
Hmm.
getting deep linking, being able to build into assets that can pop up the experience, having to have the clients available. So can cloud opportunities allow you to stream an experience in? Because back in the day when we started doing these music events, the numbers were huge because Fortnite was on mobile, right? And so
Yeah.
you had a lot of Travis Scott fans who didn't really care so much about Fortnite, but they would get into the client through their phone. It's great to see Epic has navigated that minefield, and now you to a large degree you can get Fortnite on all these platforms again because you've got to lower that barrier of entry to be able to bring in that broader ecosystem to experience metaverse style gameplay moments. And as you know, these are zeitgeist moments. Like when you can
Yeah.
get 10, 20, 30 million people around the world to log into it, it has a lot of cachet and a lot of value to a younger audience. So yeah, I think there's still a lot to come. And I hope because everyone's just pivoted away from metaverse into AI, they don't kind of forget about the fact that these really cool digital play spaces could be super, super fun and a great vehicle that you can lean into to drive awareness around a product with music being the focus of this part of our story.
Yeah, we're getting to the end. What I'd like to really focus on now is music in general. So obviously, you're working with Luke Bevins at Impress Records.
Mhm.
Tell us a bit about Impress Records and your role with them.
Yeah, the Impress is, this kind of, goes back to everything we've been talking to about music and discoverability and the challenges around kind of monoculture inside of the streaming platforms algorithms. Impressed is very, very vinyl first and vinyl focused. It's a very interesting e-commerce platform with limited edition runs, beautifully packaged, vinyl products that I it really, really got my attention. So I came on board originally as an investor and then just got to learn more and more about the company. I spent a lot of time with Luke, and the company has just recently stood up an advisory board with which I'm a member of to kind of just see where this is all going to go. It's this really interesting cross section of like the power of physical media, and I'm a real kind of analog vinyl purist in my vintage hi-fi days, but then I've spent over 20 years in gaming and love the complexities of technology. I've got a Sonos system spread out
Hmm.
across the house, but I also have a really great hi-fi with a Technics 1200 in the lounge room where I play kind of all our long format albums. And when you sit down with an album, you have the full experience, right? It's not something that, oh, I think because you like that, you might like this. You're listening to both sides. You have to be very thoughtful about when you flip side A to side B. You look at all the artwork. Luca's really, really committed to regaining the passion of what that's all about. And so, yeah, it's been a really interesting journey in working with Impress and kind of like tapping into my love of music and my love of analog sound. But we've also been equally open to like, is there a role for gaming inside of that ecosystem? So, you start thinking about the power of music soundtracks inside of a game. So, World of Warcraft's a great example that, the login music is just, it triggers people in a way that's really, really powerful, right? It'll make the hair on your arms stand up. And
Mm,
so when you put, some of these powerful music moments from your gaming experiences onto a more thoughtful physical format like vinyl, it again transcends the fact that we've just gone all in on digital, but we're very organic analog creatures. So, I love the fact that as the industry continues to grow in interesting ways, there's ideally ways to bring those across to each other. So, the jury's still out on what we can find. One of the main investors in Impressed is a gentleman from Hipster Whale who did
yeah.
Cropsy Road down in Melbourne. So there's a real love of a lot of folks that have spent 20 plus years in the games industry, of physical media and our love of music in that space. So, when you think about video games, back in the day doing the midnight launch, buying a collector's edition, right? Those World of Warcraft collector's editions were just so powerful. And when you'd have them all lined up on your shelf, it looked like, an encyclopedia set. It's something that felt like an old school fantasy library. And so, what's the world? There's companies out there that are releasing games in physical format again, everything from a Super Nintendo cartridge into, something that would work on a Game Boy Advance. And so, I think maybe we are coming full circle, or, potentially there's just going to be a little bit of a moment where gamers and younger demographics realize that they don't really own anything anymore. And it's having that tangible connection to a product that just lives inside of a digital device starts to lose a little bit of value. And so the things that you really do love, you got to find ways to bring them back into the physical space.
Well, I think especially recently with, people, with Spotify and kind of Genelex, other investments, where people kind of feel that if they're paying for Spotify, they may be paying for other things that they're not, comfortable with, or even with Apple. And when politics gets involved and people are unsure, they suddenly realize that they only have 2 to 3 platforms to choose from. And if they give money to those platforms, it may be supporting things which they don't agree with. Back to the point of physical media, like if it's a physical thing you own, then you dictate when you listen to it, and you don't have to go through another party that you may not agree with. Like, I think that is part of it, which is also the iPod trend. Have you seen this kind of trend on TikTok of people buying refurbished iPods, and
Oh
that's
yeah.
their, yeah,
Yeah, I've got 3 iPods and 4 old school iPhones, and I just kind of have set up as like a little kind of ode to Apple library behind me.
yeah,
Unfortunately, I don't that old kind of connector they used to have on the original iPods. I swear to God, I cleaned out boxes of cables about 6 months ago, and I threw them all out, thinking I'll never use these again. And now I'm looking at these iPods, going, I know they're filled with thousands of songs. I would love to be able to charge these things up and listen to them. So I think it's great. And just so you know, I've been out to concerts recently, and there's young people that have old school digital cameras. Like, they're not necessarily going back to film, but
mm,
they want the camera decoupled from their phone, because a lot of folks are just they're over the idea of just pulling your phone out constantly. So they're capturing it in a more traditional way instead of the all-in-one device. So I think it's incredible. Like, I'm so nostalgic. It's just so wired into me as a person. And
yeah,
so when I start seeing these little things pop up, I think it's great. And I really hope it's not just a trend or a fad. Vinyl, I'm really excited about, because it just continues to grow year on year, right? I think last year the category did $2 billion of business, which is just amazing.
yeah.
So yeah, I'm really hopeful that as these things reemerge, that this kind of new audience is going to see the value in it.
What is the kind of holy grail of your vinyl collection, and what are some artists that you've discovered lately that you're really into?
Oh, that's a great question. So yeah, I kind of got into the idea of getting like unique pressings in the vinyl ecosystem. Like, this is where you go to record fairs, right? And there's lots of chin stroking, vinyl collectors who've been around a long time. You'll find a first pressing of like Led Zeppelin one. That was an Aussie pressing. So I'm a big Led Zeppelin fan. So as a vinyl collector, I'm very much a dance music fan. I'm a house head from the old school Chicago, Detroit, and San
Yeah.
Francisco days. And I continue to dig into that through discords or re-releases and represses. But in that separate hi-fi I have up in the lounge, it'll be like tapping into really nice proper repressings of Primal Scream, Screamadelica, lots of old school, retro rock and roll. So yeah, that's some of the I guess the things in my vinyl collection that are really important to me. I also have a lot of music that I've repurchased that I was a big fan of when I was a DJ in Vancouver back in the late 90s. So I love dipping back into it. There's a DJ from the West Coast called DJ Buck who recently passed away. And so, it's amazing what happens when someone from back in the day is no longer with us. Everybody dips back into that catalog. And this is the concept around quality never dies. And so some of these tracks from the late 90s, I'd play in front of 1,000 people today without a worry in the world because it still sounds amazing. And that old school house sound still continues to find a voice. DJs like Mark Farina and Derek Carter are still constantly touring and playing. So I really love the fact that I'm able to continue my love of that sound as I continue to kind of evolve it over time. I still have that love. And in terms of things I've gotten into more recently, I've really gotten in this Balearic sound, right? This is something that
Hmm.
came out of Ibiza back in the day, and it's finding kind of a resurgence through DJs like Colleen Murphy. There's a great DJ out of the UK called Alice Palace, and she does a series called Slow and Seedy. And so it's really kind of slow BPM electronic, but it's very gritty. She'll bring in some hilarious re-edits of like 80s tracks. She does one with Whitesnake and she just edits it in a really clever way and grabs the sample in a unique way. So she's someone that I just absolutely love her catalog and spent a lot of time in. And then the last thing I'll share with you is another huge treasure trove of music. It's called Reverberation Radio, and it's all really come out of the kind of creative director and one of the founders for Subi Jeans, which was a big jean
Yeah.
brand in Australia back in the 2000s. He's become kind of a hotel guy. He's got a hotel up in Bali called the Slow, and another one in Crescent Head called CC. And so they've built up a soundtrack that they used in the hotel going back many years. So Reverberation Radio on Mixcloud, there are hundreds of mixes, hundreds. And it's very much surf rock, indie rock, a little bit of electronic, but it's an unbelievable kind of soundscape that I kind of have playing on my Sonos in perpetuity as I'm walking around the
Yeah.
house.
And that's the thing with DJ mixes. It's a form of communication over time. If you build up a catalog of these mixes with different flavors, like it's such a time capsule of expression. Going back to kind of the late 90s house or kind of Detroit sound. I used to go to parties in the late 90s in Melbourne, like warehouse parties, and people like Derek May and Lauren Garnier. And yeah, I have very fond memories and friends that are still very much into that sound. And artists are still touring. That it's such a great, it has a unique feel and flavor to it.
Mhm. And maybe there's ways to archive this on digital platforms in
Yeah.
interesting ways, right?
Yeah.
I'm also a burner, and I've been to Burning Man a number of times, and there's always interesting tech products that pop up off the back of it, right? It's very much an event about unplugging, but the event is just full of people from Silicon Valley. So there's a lot of clever, smart folks that have built VR experiences and kind of created that concept of community from the playa and bringing it into digital platforms. So yeah, I'm a big fan of finding ways to bring kind of archived footage and bring it into a digital environment to give people another view.
I think we're down to the end, the kind of final boss game that we like to talk about, or the definitive game that you put on the trophy shelf.
Oh man, the boss game. So yeah, that's so hard to pick, right? Because there's just so many different times in your life where games were so incredibly influential.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm gonna. It's funny. I'm gonna stick to Blizzard on this one, and because there's a bit of a story to it, and talk about StarCraft too. So I couldn't get into WoW because the MMORPG thing wasn't quite right for me. I'd never played an RTS until
Right.
StarCraft 2. And that was a game I worked on, from announce. And there was such a beautiful moment where the game was announced in Korea with the pre-rendered cinematic and with Tychus at the end, the last frame saying it's about time. But they actually redubbed it and reanimated it in Korean for the South Korean announce, because we all know the history of StarCraft in South Korea. But that's a game that, I really fell in love with the storytelling. The sci-fi setting was great. And then a lot of devs will say, play the single player game and that will train you for multiplayer. They don't necessarily succeed at that, but StarCraft 2 got into my head enough through playing the campaign through, they'd broken the campaign into three for the three factions. And so I ended up going deep into the multiplayer ecosystem, everything down to that ladder anxiety you would get with the countdown clock, the music when you would launch the game. I have the StarCraft 2 soundtrack on vinyl for the record.
Yeah.
That's another one I've got. And I really fell in love with it. And it's the whole concept of it really ticked the box from like a high action, intense game that was very similar to some of those experiences I had playing, Quake 3 Arena online back in the day. But with this meta, it was the micro macro concept where you had to also be battlefield strategist while simultaneously, clicking on things hundreds of times to be able to kind of rally that force and then build up your tech tree and then build up your base and make sure you weren't going to get cheese through the back door. And it actually changed the way I thought. It rewired my approach to things. I started looking at challenges in my regular day-to-day life through a new lens. And so, yeah, a really powerful moment. Not only a great game, in a great setting, in a great environment built by an amazing team, and drove that competitive nature inside of me, but it actually got me to kind of think about the world in a different way based on the gameplay loop.
Yeah. I read an article recently and someone was talking about kind of the future of AI agents and agent swarms and how they believe people would deploy agents for various tasks. And they said they kind of felt it could be very similar to how StarCraft 2 works in terms of deployment and strategy. That would be potentially the future. So people are playing interactive experiences to deploy agents to do actual work, but it would be incredibly similar to something like StarCraft 2, which is fascinating. Like that's kind of a hybrid of the practical and the terrifying and kind of interactive,
Yeah, it's wild to think of where we are with AI today because, AI features prominently in StarCraft 2, right? The path finding, the NPCs, the character movement. And then there was a relationship between the dev team and Google DeepMind that went on for quite some time when they were training it using, a special build of the game. And I came across, a gentleman working in AI here a number of years ago. This is probably 8 or 9 years ago. And he was working over in the Google building, which is right across from where Blizzard was based at the time in Sydney. And we got him to come in and talk to us. So I had the whole publishing team together, and he kind of explained how they were training AI using StarCraft 2. And then to think about where we are today and this kind of concept of it coming full circle and StarCraft still being a reference point for thinking about how A functions in these kind of like, it's a kind of agent bot environment that is currently the hot topic in town in and around AI. I find fascinating.
Yeah, and that's what great art is, right? It kind of illuminates a path and stands a test of time, and then people compare reality against it and go, well, it's kind of like this. But I think some of the very recently tools like OpenClaw and autonomous agents, where OpenClaw is a AI agent tool that you install on your computer or on a virtual machine, and it attacks the root of the computer and then can cycle up as many agents as you want with various roles and stuff. But it can also, you can talk to it on, Telegram or WhatsApp, or it can call you and you can give all your agents like various identities and names and pretend they're real people, but it can run off and connect to anything you want it to and do anything you need from, and talk to people. It's terrifying. That's the swarm idea. And that's going back to when you look at that en masse for various production tasks, or say you're running game studio, or you're making anything, it's that, times 500 operated with like a kind of UI and meta of StarCraft 2.
Yeah, fascinating times. I know there's been a lot of concern around what's happening in AI, particularly because of the headwinds in the games industry, and just so many people losing their jobs and restructures. But outside of the Gen AI piece, I think there's just so many interesting things happening in and around an AI, and the games ecosystem was probably one of the biggest users of old school kind of, AI,
Yeah.
particularly when when you play the machine, right? That was all the early stages of machine learning that was supporting that technology. So I'm really hopeful that AI finds a place in game development and game design that is acceptable to fans more broadly and helps drive the category forward.
I think in the UGC space, we're going to see more innovation because of AI versus, kind of more traditional game dev. Because looking at Roblox, for example, like they now have in beta a system where, people can prompt, I want a pickle car with burger wheels and machine guns on the side. So it will generate the mesh, it will rig the mesh, it will put kind of Lua code or gameplay logic to that, and it will work, right? As a game developer, you're like, well, I built this experience with these rules and you're playing in my space. But in UGC, they're really enabling players to be incredibly empowered. And then as a developer, you go, well, I have to work in this space where anything can be anything. That is the challenge. And I think those effects of what happens in UGC will eventually impact, more traditional game dev. That's my take.
Yeah, no, it's a great take.
Chris, it's been awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, it's been amazing. Thank you so much for the invite, Ben. We really enjoyed it.
All right. Cheers, Chris. Thanks so much.
Take care, Ben. Ciao.